You don't have to have very many conversations before the person you're talking to who has questions about Christianity raises this question. Isn't the Bible culturally and socially regressive? I mean, look what it teaches about women. Look what it teaches about slavery. Look what it teaches about sexual morality. Look what it teaches about homosexuality. I mean, the Bible may have been good for back then, but the fact is, it is so out of touch with modern people. And if we lived by what it teaches, wouldn't that like throw us back into the dark ages? And isn't it so regressive? Isn't it so restrictive of our freedoms? So how do you respond to a question like that in a half-hour sermon? Well, what I want to do is set up for you what I call constructs. Here are some main ideas that you need to keep in mind as you read your Bible and you interact with people who will quote things to you, especially out of the Old Testament, and say, well, how's that for family values? So let's just start going through some of this stuff, and I'll try to help you set up a framework for your thinking. Let's just take the women issue. Is the Bible regressive regarding women? Well, by whose standard do we measure or judge regressive or progressive? I mean, what's the plumb line? You know what a plumb line is? It's a string with a weight. And it gets you, people know what level is. Level is something that's perfectly, flat this way. If there was such a thing as vertical level, it would be plumb on a level. That's what you call it, plumb. And a great way to get it, it's a plumb line. You just tie a string to it and hang a weight. And you can see that line is going to be straight up and down. And so when you build your wall, the wall is held to the standard of the plumb line, not the other way around. And that's the problem. When you want to start talking what is regressive, socially or culturally, versus what is progressive, who's to say what is regressive and what is progressive? I mean, what's the plumb line? The problem that you have with some teachings of the Bible may be based on what C.S. Lewis and Timothy Keller call an unexamined belief in the superiority of your own culture and historical moment over all others. We who look back at that time look at something written and say, "Oh, I can't believe it. How could those people think that?" Whoa, time out. The position that you hold and that you think right now in 21st century affluent North America in Western culture, there are some views your grandparents held that you would be aghast at. And there will be views that they, looking down the corridor of time, couldn't believe that you hold to now. And whatever you think is right now, just run the clock forward. In a couple generations, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren are going to look back at you the same way you look at your great-grandparents' generation and think, man, how could they think that? What you have to realize is you're a product and a child of history, culture, and environment. And you look at the Bible unaware that you yourself stand in a cultural context. And it might be inappropriate to just assume that your position right here now in affluent Northern America, Western culture, 21st century, is the right position, the plumb line by which all others should be judged. So keep that in mind. Don't necessarily assume the superiority of your culture and historical moment over all others. And that is a great example. The Anglo-Saxons, they would have taken great offense that Jesus forgave Peter's denials. In their culture, he should have been killed for that. But they would have agreed completely with a deity who punished his enemies. They just couldn't agree with forgiving someone. How do you love someone who has wronged you? Isn't that an affront to your family's honor? By which they don't mean honor the way you do in the 21st century. They mean pride. And so you should take retribution and defend your family honor. See, there's a teaching of the Bible and a practice of Jesus that is totally against Anglo-Saxon culture back then. How can we use our time standard of progressive as the plumb line by which we decide which parts of the Bible are valid or not. And that's really what people are doing. This whole issue of the Bible is culturally regressive is part of the prong to attack the Bible and to say it shouldn't be read or believed or Christianity is for a former time. Many beliefs and views of one generation will be viewed as outmoded, simply passé. So keep careful. Don't just assume that modern culture is the plumb line and the standard by which we measure things. Now, when you consider moral relativists, we talked about this a few weeks ago, it is moral relativists who claim that there's no basis for objectively judging another person's culture or another culture's morality to be better than one or another. Yet they truly believe that some practices and cultures of morality are inferior or superior to others. Remember this lady, anthropologist Carolyn Loban? She did a lot of work with women of various cultures in Africa, and she concluded that the women are treated brutally. They're very much discriminated against. They're not respected at all. They're held in low esteem. And she felt she should do something about that. But she felt conflict because she knew that her value of women is born out of 18th century Western culture. So how could she say that her culture's values are better than the African culture's values? And she found herself at a bit of a conflict, a bit of a crossroads. She knew the oppression of women in other cultures was wrong, but she felt her view that oppressing women is wrong was simply relative, rooted in Northern European 18th century culture. So a relativist has a real problem identifying something as right or wrong. So how then do they say the Bible's teaching, another culture and another time, is regressive? You're a relativist. You've already decided that one culture can't be better than another. They're just different. So why do you do toward the Bible what you wouldn't do elsewhere? Well, she knows intuitively the mistreatment of women is wrong, but because she's bought into cultural and moral relativism, she can't defend her position. See the bind a relativist is in? Now, we are theists. We're not relativists. We take what God has said to be the plumb line. And if it lines up with what God has said, then it's right and it is true and it should be practiced. And atheists can't do that. Atheism can't speak to morality. Any attempt to question the morality of the God of the Bible based on atheistic ideas of right or wrong, progressive or regressive, is just filled with error and self-contradiction. And yet that's what's happening. There are many who are agnostic or atheists who totally reject the moral code of the Bible. Well, on the basis of what? You have no standard. If you're an atheist, your standard is survival of the fittest. In fact, if you're an atheist, you should believe what Charles Darwin believed, that evolutionary chance and survival of the fittest and, you just naturally adapted to your environment better led to you to be stronger. If you're an atheist, by the way, you would have no problem logically with assuming the superiority of men. Charles Darwin didn't. If you read The Descent of Man, in his book, he says that men are superior to women. You don't believe me? I'm telling you, he does. You can tell by your faces, what? Never heard that. No. Charles Darwin, in his book, says men are in every way, physically and intellectually, in every way, we're superior to women. Evolution has made it such. And we teach that guy's theories in our schools. Well, we don't mention that, but he said it. Darwinian evolution leads quite logically to racism and sexism. You can read what he's written about, how the darker skinned peoples are, not as evolved as the lighter skinned peoples. And then Friedrich Nietzsche, and he applies Darwinism to society. And then you got guys like, Heinrich Himmler applying it to the final solution in Germany. They just logically carried out the extension of their evolution. Here, let me read this to you. This is a quote from his book. I'm not making this stuff up. With mankind, the differences between the sexes are greater than in most species. Man, on an average, is considerably taller, heavier, and stronger than woman, with squarer shoulders and more plainly pronounced muscles. Man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women. Sorry, that'll tickle my throat. And has a more inventive genius. His brain is absolutely larger. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man attaining to higher eminence in whatever he takes up than a woman can attain, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of senses and hands. He goes on. If two lists were made of the most eminent men and the most eminent women in poetry, painting, sculpture, and music, comprising composition and performance, history and science and philosophy, with a half dozen names under each subject, the two lists would not bear comparison. We may also infer from the law of the deviation of averages that if men are capable of decided eminence over women in many subjects, the average standard of mental power in man must be above that of woman. Thus, man has ultimately become superior to woman. And you object to the Bible? That's Charles Darwin. This guy, Kyle Butt's great. He wrote a response to this. This is classic. It's so good I had to give it to you. Using Darwin's line of reasoning, which we just read in his book, it would be impossible to condemn men for treating women as inferior, because if men have the mental or physical ability to treat women as inferior, it must mean that men are stronger or more fit to survive and rule. It is ironic that the atheistic community, which is so enamored with Darwin, is suggesting that the Bible's view of women is immoral. In reality, if their view of atheistic evolution is true, then all male-dominated societies are such because males are more able to dominate. And since survival of the fittest is desired, one must conclude that a male-dominated society in which women are viewed as inferior to men, as Darwin put it, must be at least one very prevalent natural order of things. So Kyle Butt's saying, look at what Darwin said. The fact that men rule, it's just evolution made it that way. So on the basis of what do you say it's wrong? Shouldn't we oppress them? We are the stronger. Survival of the fittest. Nature has thus ordained it, right? Even if the skeptical community is right concerning its accusations about the Bible's mistreatment of women, which it's not, how could the Bible be accused of maintaining an immoral stance when that stance coincides perfectly with the Darwinian view of the natural order of things? In truth, those who propound atheism and Darwinian ideals have a much more thorny problem with the logical implications of their ideas as they relate to women than those who teach that the Bible is the inspired word of a perfectly moral God. He is spot on right. He's spot on right. This is classic. I stumbled upon this week. I do extensive research. These are the hand-scribbled notes that Charles Darwin made when he was trying to decide whether or not to marry this girl that he liked. So on one side, he wrote marry. On the other side, he wrote not marry. Let's see. I'm just going to print it out, what's written on this side. Just notes. Children, constant companion, friend in old age, who will feel interested in me, object to be loved and played with, better than a dog anyhow. His writing. Home, someone to take care of the house, charms of music and female chit-chat. These things are good for one's health, but terrible loss of time. Only picture to yourself a nice soft wife on a sofa with good fire, books, and music perhaps. Excuse me? Modern man has a problem with what the Bible teaches about women, but gives Darwin a pass and teaches evolution in schools? Do you see a double standard here? I do. Could you imagine if some Christian said this? Yeah, wife, yeah, that's good. Play with her, better than a dog. I kid you not, that's Charles Darwin, folks. Is the Bible regressive toward women? Well, first off, if you're an atheist, please sit down and you got nothing to say on this count. Darwinian evolution logically leads to racism and sexism and the position that you can't say it's right or wrong. Nature just does it, survival of the fittest. Who can say it's wrong? It's just evolution working its way out. They have a bigger problem than the theist does. But keep this in mind. The biblical passage that bothers you may not teach what it appears to be teaching. You have to think cultural context. And as Westerners in the 21st century, we, especially in the last 50 years, we have a huge problem with this because we really don't know history and we simply don't understand culture beyond our own. Just an example, what does the Bible teach about slavery? Well, when you think slavery, you think, the South and the rum and sugarcane and chattel slavery by race. In the Roman world, you could be a brutally treated slave, but you may have preferred that. I mean, where did they get their slaves from? Conquered peoples. Well, most cultures just killed them all. They didn't have prisoner of war camps. So if you wanted to surrender, you would. If you didn't, you'd fight to the death. But when you got taken over, you would be taken and sold as a slave. And that happened in the Roman Empire. It happened all over the world, and there was no one to say or think that it wasn't right to do. Then you have the type of slavery. It wasn't one race. It was anyone. And a lot of the kind of slavery you read about in the Roman world was not the kind like Spartacus. You could sell yourself. You could sell one of your children. And really what you were doing was selling your labor. A slave could own property. A slave could buy his freedom. A slave could love his master and be adopted. In the Jewish people, slaves were set free. You could indenture someone, and every 7th year they'd go free, and every 50th year of Jubilee, everyone would be freed. So you have to step back and get to understand the ancient culture into which the Bible was written. And how about laws regarding the treatment of women? There are Old Testament laws that talk about, what should happen if a woman is accused of adultery. Well, there are ways she can prove her innocence. And modern man looks at that and says, oh, that's terrible. Well, time out. In the culture of the day, in fact, even in some cultures of this earth, if a woman is accused of adultery by her husband, she gets stoned or executed or her head chopped off. In the Old Testament law that God set up, there were ways, checks and balances for a woman to protect herself and prove her innocence. Or slaves. There's a passage in the Old Testament that says if you defeat an enemy and you see a woman and you desire her, you can take her, but you have to take her home to live with your family for a month. She has to shave her head. You give her a change of clothing. And if at the end of the month you're still happy with her, you can take her as your wife. And people go, oh, that's horrible. No, but step back and look at the culture. In ancient cultures, if you fought a people and warred against them and you killed all the men, what happened in those ancient cultures? And what happens in much of the world today? The women are raped, pillaged, plundered, used, passed around until everyone's done with them. Then they get sold. Not so for ancient Israel. If there's a woman you want, you take her home. She lives with your family for a month. You give her a change of clothes. She has to shave her head as a sign of mourning. At the end of the month, if you're happy with her, well, you can marry her. That was unheard of, to treat a woman prisoner with dignity like that. So when you come across these passages in the Old Testament or you see them on the internet all the time, please recognize the culture and the historical context into which they were written. It totally changes your understanding of it. And then you begin to say, oh, they were really protecting women in a culture that didn't, rather than, setting up regressive policies. You just can't look through the lens of 21st century modernism when you read moral codes written 3,000 years ago, okay? Modern critics cite Old Testament laws without understanding the intent of the law or how the Israelite community interpreted and applied the law. This is a great idea. What these critics should do is read the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds to see how Jewish people understood and applied the law in their time. It's really important to do that. Understand the historical context against the backdrop of the practices of other nations. That's key in understanding the Old Testament code. It's key. I was reading about New Testament atrocities. Here are some of the New Testament atrocities. This is a quote. The author of Ephesians insists that wives should submit to their husbands in everything. The authors of Colossians, Titus, and Peter all agree that women should submit to their husbands. Okay, that's one person's idea of an atrocity. Okay, but does that person understand that the husband she submits to is a man who loves her more than himself, a man who is called to lay down his life for his wife in the same way that Christ laid down his life for the church? And besides, it's a role issue, not a worth issue. The Bible teaches that men and women are of equal value, both being made in the image of God, right? God said, let's make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and the cattle over all the earth, every creeping thing. Then God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Wow! That really elevates women to be ontologically, with regard to being equal to man. The Bible does assign different roles and responsibility for men and women. It does for people at large, too, like I'm told to submit to my government. Is the Bible therefore teaching that senators and congressmen are worth more and more valuable than me? No, we have a role to play here. Jesus submitted to the Father. Would the Bible then be teaching that Jesus and the Father have different value? No. We confuse roles with values and worth. The Bible doesn't do that. Husbands are called upon to love and lead their wives, to give their lives for their wives, to physically provide food, shelter, and clothing for their families, to love their wives as much as they love themselves. That's what the Bible calls a man to do. Paul's writing stuff in the first century that was unheard of. Women were property in the first century, even among the Jewish community. Even among the Jewish community. And then following Jesus' lead, the role of women is greatly elevated by the teaching of the Bible. Wives are called to respect their husbands and submit to them. Is that such an atrocity? Well, it may be for someone living in late 20th, early 21st century Western culture, but most of the planet has no problem with it. Most of the planet thinks it's just good family policy that someone leads and the rest follow. Only since the 20th century has Western culture grown increasingly opposed to the idea of male leadership and female submission to male leadership. Most of the planet's fine with it. And besides, you have to take it in its context. If Christianity was so brutally oppressive and regressive, why did women flock to the church in the first century? Why did women outnumber men in the church in the first century? Jesus, New Testament teaching, and early Christianity elevated women way above cultural norms. I'll give you some examples. You can read Reconstructing the Rise of Christianity, the Role of Women by Stark. Here's some of his research. In the Greco-Roman world, where women were severely disadvantaged, even upper-class women, Christianity accorded women considerable status and made life more attractive for female members. For starters, there was no infanticide among the Christians. Female infanticide was widely practiced in the world. If you had a child and it was a girl, you'd leave it out on the hills to die of exposure, or you'd give it to the wild animals, or you would yourself poison it and kill it and bury it. You can read letters of men to the guy's away on a business trip or away at war. He writes back, hope we have a son. If it's a girl, kill it. You can read these letters. And no one in the world objected. Well, the Christians did. They had a totally different view of women. Baby's born, if it's a girl, you value it and treasure it. You don't kill it. The advantages of Christian females, therefore, began at birth in the Christian community. While infanticide was widely practiced by the Greco-Romans, it was female infants who were killed, and the Christians forbade that. Male or female, they forbade it. There was no forced early marriage among Christians. In the Roman world, they had laws that said you can't marry the girl off before she's 12, but there was no penalty if you did. That even happens in the modern world. The founder of Islam, he had a bunch of wives. One of them was 6 years old. He consummated the marriage when she was 9. In modern America, we would say that's pedophile, we'd really be on that guy. But Muhammad gets a total pass. There were no forced early marriages among the Christians. Sorry. No forced early marriages. Roman society often married the girl before puberty, but the Christians were much older. In fact, look at the stats. Nearly half of Christian women were still single at age 18. There was no abortion among Christians. And you would say, well, that's regressive. Time out. Remember, think culture and context. Once married, pagan girls, that's someone who wasn't Christian, had a substantially lower life expectancy. Much of the difference being due to the great prevalence of abortion, which involved barbaric methods in an age without soap and antibiotics. Now, given the very significant threat to the life and agony of the procedure, one might wonder why a woman would take such a risk. She didn't. Women never wanted to abort their babies until the modern era, when it's an inconvenience and an embarrassment to have a child. But throughout all of world history, there is just a very powerful nurturing, mothering effect. Women never wanted to abort their babies. They didn't do it voluntarily. It was men, husbands, lovers, fathers, who made the decision to abort, and it was forced on the women of the Roman world. It isn't surprising that the world that gave husbands the right to demand infant girls be done away with would also give men the right to order their wives, mistresses, and daughters to abort. Both Plato and Aristotle advocated mandatory abortions to limit family size and for other reasons. This is the Roman world into which Christianity comes, and the Christians absolutely forbid abortion and infanticide. So that wound up being a real advantage for a woman. Christian wives did not have abortions, nor did the Jewish wives. According to Didache, a first-century manual of church teachings, thou shalt not murder a child by abortion, nor kill them when born, infanticide. Now, in modern times, we would look back and say that's regressive. Back then, it was a lifesaver for women. They didn't want abortions. And in the Christian community, no one would force you to have it. By the way, there was no double standard for men either. See, back then, women weren't supposed to run around, but it was okay for the guys, not in the Christian community. Christian women, therefore, enjoyed very important advantages in terms of a secure marriage and family life. Early Christians prized female chastity, and they rejected the double standard that gave men sexual license. Christian men were urged to remain virgins until marriage, and extramarital sex was denounced as adultery. Now, today, we would say that's repressive. Yeah, the women of the first century world loved that. They could marry a man and fully expect that he would be faithful and true to them. The church required it. The Christian community required it. And there was no frivolous divorce among Christians like there was in the culture. In the culture, you could divorce a woman just because. Or you could accuse her of adultery and get her executed. Not among the Christians, no way. No frivolous divorce among the Christians. Roman law committed a man to divorce his wife, permitted, by simply kicking her out. Not among the Christians. And there was no forced remarriage of widows either. In the ancient world, Augustus passed a law. If a woman whose husband died didn't remarry in 2 years, she started getting fined. Didn't know that. It's true. But not among the Christians. The Christians did not require a woman to remarry. They put her on a list and took care of her. See, women from birth through infancy, through teenage, through childbearing years, through her mothering, even when she was an old lady, was treated special and to be protected and prized by her husband and her community in the Bible. In the Bible. Christianity held great appeal for women, such that there was a higher percentage of women in churches than men. In the world at the time, the ratio was there was about 1/3 more men than women, because they aborted so many babies who were girls. But in the church, even though the culture had more men than women, the church had more women than men. So all these people who say, well, the Bible is socially regressive and oppressive on women, oh yeah? Tell the women of the first century that. They flocked to the church. They loved the teachings of Christianity. They protected them, prospered them, and blessed them. In the society at large, men outnumbered women by 1/3, but in the church, women outnumbered men. Ancient sources and modern historians agree that women conversion to Christianity was more prevalent among women than men, and as the generations went by, this grew due to no abortion or infanticide of women. See how it helps to think in a cultural, historical context when you handle this issue? So, in Christian communities, women enjoyed superior status, relatively greater power and freedom in comparison with their pagan counterparts. The Christian community had more favorable view of women. It's a fact. No abortion, no infanticide, no incest, no marital infidelity, no polygamy, no sex outside of marriage for women or men, no frivolous divorce, no forced remarriage. Unheard of, but loved by the women of the first century who flocked to Christianity in droves. They were treated so much better. So Christian women enjoyed greater marital security and equality than their pagan neighbors. That's just a historical fact. Does anyone know this? No. Most of the internet articles and the college professors, they really don't know history. They really don't understand culture beyond their own 21st century Western culture. So think broader and deeper when you consider these things. This is Wikipedia. Okay, you don't gotta read Hebrew and Greek. Wikipedia, man. From the beginning, the early Christian church, starting with Jesus, women were more important members of the movement. The examples, the manner of Jesus reveal his attitudes towards women and show repeatedly how he liberated and affirmed women. We see Jesus treating women with compassion, grace, and dignity. The Gospels of the New Testament, especially Luke, often mention Jesus speaking to or helping women publicly and openly, contrary to the social norms of the time. He reached out to the marginalized in his society, and thus his appeal was great. Martha's sister sat at his feet being taught, a privilege reserved only for men in Jerusalem. Even Wikipedia knows this. Jesus had female followers who were his sponsors. He stopped to express concern for the women of Jerusalem on his way to be crucified. Mary Magdalene is recorded to be the first person to have the privilege of seeing Jesus after his resurrection. Jesus charged her to tell others of what she had seen, even though the testimony of a woman at that time was not considered valid. As time went on, the disciples continued to spread Jesus' message by word of mouth. Groups of Christians organized within their homes. Those who could offer their home for meetings were considered important within the movement. Lydia was one such woman in Acts. She has a church meeting in her house. Please don't read the Bible as socially regressive or repressive on women. It is anything but, folks, and even Wikipedia knows that. Compare Christian communities and societies to others. The Christian community and the culture impacted by Christianity. Compare that to other communities and communities not impacted by Christianity. Where would you rather live? Which treats women better? Well, let's let the women speak. This lady, Rafat Hassan, is a Pakistani-born professor of religion and Qumran studies at, I think, the University of Louisville. The way Islam has been practiced in most Muslim societies for centuries has left millions of women, Muslim women, with battered bodies, minds, and souls. That's the Arab world in the 21st century. Wife beating is so prevalent in the Muslim world that social workers who assist battered women in Egypt, for example, spend much of their time trying to convince the victims that their husband's violent acts are unacceptable. That's World Magazine, Time World Magazine. It's not a Christian magazine. They just think a husband's violent act and beating them is what's the norm. They have to convince them that that's not acceptable behavior. And you want to say Christianity is regressive? How about Hinduism? What's happening in India? In a culture that idolizes sons and dreads the birth of a daughter, to be born female comes perilously close to being born less than human. That's the Indian government's report of Department of Women and Child Development. Hinduism is the religion of Islam. And I already told you what the founder of evolution and Darwinism thinks. Folks, understand culture and history, and there's no way you can say Christianity is regressive and socially oppressive to women. Not at all. Well, what about what it teaches about sexual morality and homosexuality? Well, the Bible teaches that there are a lot of things that are wrong. It's the plumb line. Now, here's 5 passages of Scripture that list a whole bunch of bad stuff. I'm not going to read them to you. I'm just going to flip through them because I'm kind of out of time. You can go to them. But I want you to know that all this bad stuff, there's everything in there. Greed, materialism, pride, gossip, heterosexual immorality, homosexuality. It's all bad stuff. Lots of sins listed in the Bible. The Bible teaches there are a lot of things that are wrong. Jesus taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Have you ever seen the news where church members stand up and hold placards that say, God hates fags? I think, how can you do that? We welcome people into our church who aren't refined in the Christian graces yet. Hey, maybe you're sleeping around. Maybe you're greedy. Maybe you're a materialist. Maybe you're a homosexual. Maybe you're a gossip. You know what? You can be washed and cleaned and come to a whole new level of living. Jesus bids you come. Jesus is the one who said, love your neighbors as yourself. So where do some Christians get off doing stuff like this? Yes, we think there are some things that are wrong, but that doesn't mean we hate you. We love people even though we think what they're doing is wrong. Western society has changed its views on heterosexual morality and homosexuality in the past few decades. Who is to say that the new morality is progressive? When society accepts and then approves behaviors it once identify as wrong, how is that progressive? It's not. We've already talked about a plumb line. How do you decide? Against what standard? Remember these? The 7 deadly sins? You almost don't hear about them anymore. Pride, greed, envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, and sloth. The fact is, they have become the lifestyle of a lot of North American Christians. What about the 7 holy virtues? Humility, charity, kindness, patience, sexual purity, self-control, and diligence. These are the things that are important to God, and these should characterize our lives. Yes, we should live the moral standard our Bible teaches. Yes, we should clearly explain what is sin and what is not. But the whole time, we should love people like Jesus did. Jesus didn't hate them. He died for their sins. Tim Keller notes that to stay away from Christianity, because part of the Bible's teaching is offensive to you, assumes that if there is a God, he wouldn't have any views that upset you. And that's silly. Just because the Bible teaches some things you don't agree with doesn't mean you should avoid Christianity. Consider the Bible's core claims about who Jesus is, and whether or not he rose from the dead, whether or not he is who he claimed to be and did what he claimed. Consider those things before rejecting it for less central, more controversial teachings. Distinguish between the major themes and message of the Bible and its less primary teachings. When I was a kid, I remember this movie came on called The Stepford Wives. Remember that? I vaguely remember it, but the ladies were like robots, and they were made to do everything the husband wanted them to do. So they were like real calm, and they didn't have any kind of like emotional fluctuation. They were like robots. And the guys thought this was terrific. Well, Keller suggests that if you want a God who only thinks and acts and does according to what you want, then you want a Stepford wife, a Stepford God. You want a God who's a robot who never crosses your will. You want a God who's wonderfully compliant and beautiful, but not personal. You want a God who can't challenge and correct your thinking. You want a God with whom you cannot have a personal relationship. You want a robot God or a Stepford God. If you eliminate everything from the Bible that offends you or upsets you or that you disagree with, you'll never have a God who can contradict you, grow you, and teach you. You'll have a God of your own making, but you can't have a personal relationship with someone who can't disagree with you. You can't have a personal relationship with someone who can't question you and make you think. Folks, an authoritative Bible is like the precondition for a personal relationship with God. So we do not view Christianity as regressive or oppressive for women or sexual purity or homosexuality or any one of a dozen sins like materialism and greed that our culture is in love with. We don't hold that view at all. In fact, here's our view. New Testament Christianity affirms Christ's moral authority and every person's dignity. New Testament Christianity affirms Christ's moral authority and every person's dignity. Let's close with a word of prayer.